So this is In Between with Peter Posen, and here we are in the valley of Hinnom. Hinnom is just south of the old city. Mount Zion's just right above me. So we're at the foot of Mount Zion, and this valley goes straight down to the Kidron Valley, and you have the Gihon spring. So there's lots of water for potters. And we have Potter's Field here where Judas Iscariot hung himself, and they bought the field for foreigners with the money that he was paid, the 30 pieces of silver. And so criminals and non-Jews would be buried in the Potter's Field, and that's just right down here. So it kind of goes into this segment 2, which is about the techniques of making ancient pottery. And in the earliest, you had what's called sun-baked pottery. They would bake it in the sun, but that was very brittle. And then later on, they developed what's called a pit or a hearth technique, where they would dig a pit, and they would heat up the charcoals and put the pots in, and then cover it with straw or burning material or pieces of pottery that was already fired, and kind of conceal that heat in. And this is what you call low firing. Firing is the baking of pottery, and so the low fire had low temperature, and the pottery was much more brittle and easier to break. When you have a high fire, that also can, to a certain point, cause the pots to break or become brittle as well. So the earliest we have, of course, is the sun bake, and then the oven bake. And around 800 Celsius, you would have this covered for 2 to 3 days. And so you had the low firing and the high firing. And if the high firing was too high temperature, the pot could break. But with putting the pots in the hearth or the pit, you couldn't regulate the temperature. So they came up with another design. It's called a kiln. A kiln is basically an oven where you bake pottery. And so they had the hearth, which was the first type of kiln, and then they developed what's called a trench. And so here we have the trench, and they would cut into the side of the hill, and they would make a trench, and that acted as a flue or a chimney, and they would place the pots partway up the trench, and they would put the fire down below. And this technique, you could always add more fuel. With the hearth or the pit, basically when the charcoal's burnt out of heat, then that was the end of your firing. Whereas this, you could add more fuel, and you usually built it direction of the wind, so the wind could blow the heat and the smoke up the trench up over to the back of the hill. And this is called a C-shape kiln. And this, where you're like in a flat area, you would make a horseshoe shape kiln. You place the pots in the back wall, and then the fire would be in the front. And then you would cover over the top with pottery or shingles, and that would keep the heat in this area. And you can add more fuel to the fire and keep your temperature much better regulated. And then they came up with a third one, which is called an updraft kiln. And this is much, much more structural. As you can see, you have a place down here for the fire. And the fire was down at the bottom. And you had a shelf with holes in it right here. And all the heat would come up from the fire chamber. And you would place your pots in here, and then you would cover the top with tiles or old pottery, and that would keep the heat in. And so this was a high firing kiln, very similar to the ones we use today. This is all done with wood, but we also have today, we have kilns that run on electricity. So let's talk about techniques of molding the molding the clay. You had three different techniques. You had a hand working, or using your hands. You have the wheel, and then you have a mold where you press the clay into the mold. And with the hand working, they would roll out the clay in coils and build it up and knead the coils in. Of course, that could always have air pockets. Whenever you had air pockets, you know, there's a good chance that the vessel would rupture during the heating process. Another technique they would use is they would roll out flat sheets and then put the flat sheets together. I mentioned during the dust to dust segment, when we're talking about burial, there was a burial box called a larynx. And the larynx burial box was a square box where they put the bones in. They made much larger boxes where they could kind of squeeze the whole body into. And these were square, so they would make flat sheets of clay and then mold it into a square box. And so you have the coils and then you have the sheets. So these were the type of things you would use with the hand working. And with the coils, they would smooth out the side and make flat surfaces. So the wheel came into production. The first wheel was in Egypt in 2400 BCE. And around 2000 BCE, we can see it here in the land of Canaan. And so the wheel had a slow wheel and you had a fast wheel. All right, so this is the slow wheel up here. And you have a flat disc with a hole for a stick. And you would take that stick and spin it around, take the stick out as it gets up to speed, and then you would get into the clay with your hands. But as soon as your hand makes contact, the wheel would start to slowly slow down. So you'd have to stick the stick back in the hole, spin it around again, and this took a long process, a lot of spins in order to get up enough speed for the slow wheel. Then they came up with the fast wheel. The fast wheel, as you see here, you have a large stone wheel, which probably may have been a grinding wheel for flour or wheat, or even one for making olive oil. So you have this large grinding wheel, and then you would put a pedestal with a smaller table where you put the clay. Here's the clay. And then you would have a chair, and you would sit on the chair, and with your foot, you would spin this large stone base. I actually have worked on one of this when I had a pottery class. I had a pottery class, and I would spin it 3 or 4 times with my foot to get up enough speed to deal with the clay. So this is the fast wheel, and this is the slow wheel. So here I have a picture taken out of a book. This was filmed in Afghanistan in 1972. This is a slow wheel. And you see the guy with the stick right here, and this is the clay right here. And this guy in Afghanistan is using an ancient technique, one of the oldest techniques. All 3 techniques and kilns, as well as wheels, are still used today in different parts of the world. Then the third thing I want to talk about is molds. They would make molds out of stone or out of wood, or they would even make a mold out of a ceramic and then fire it. And then what you would do is you take the wet clay and squeeze it into the mold and make an impression. A lot of the oil lamps from the Roman and Byzantine period, they would take one half of the lamp and the other half of the lamp, and you had 2 molds, and then they would put them together and make the oil lamp and use wet clay to make the seam, to glue the seams together. Another thing they did all through the generations is making clay idols. When you formed an idol out of clay, these are usually household idols. They were small, they'd fit on your shelf in your house, and they would form them out of clay by hand, but then when they came in with the mold technique, they could mass produce stuff. And that's why we have so many ancient idols found in the dirt, as well as oil lamps. Thousands and thousands of oil lamps from the Roman period and Byzantine have been found, because they would stay intact in the ground because of their structure, and they would find them in tombs as well. So in the tombs, the oil lamps were perfectly preserved. So you'd find them in the ground, you'd find them in tombs, sometimes in houses up against the wall with dirt filled on top of them. And so the oil lamps preserved very well, as well as several of the idols, because they were small. And so using the mold technique gave you the ability of mass production. So we've been talking a lot about the ancient pottery and how ancient pottery was formed. We talked about the wheel, we've talked about the kilns, the ovens where they bake in. And so here I am at a friend's house, Gayla Goodman's house, and she has a pottery studio. So let's go into her studio and see her throw a pot. And here she is, what you call throwing a pot. Now this pottery wheel is run by a motor, and she has a switch that she regulates the foot with her foot rather than pushing it with her foot like I've done on the big fast wheel. And as you look at her hands, she's putting pressure on the inside and guiding it with the fingers on the outside, and using centrifugal force, she's slowly pushing it up in an upward position. And over here we have her kiln. How hot does that get, by the way?
1,200 degrees.
1,200 degrees.
For 24 hours. It takes about 24 to 36 hours.
Depending on the pottery, or just...
No, it has to heat up slowly, get to that temperature, and then slowly cool down. It just takes time.
Okay. And so we were talking about tempering. You know, you get your clay probably in a store or something. In the ancient times, they would put animal dung. Do you put any animal dung in here?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay.
I buy it ready.
Okay. And as you see, she's slowly forming it up to higher and higher. And then when the clay is hardened and dried, she will add the different decorations using glazing or other types of techniques. So El Yehud pottery, which is from the Middle Bronze and part of the first part of the Late Bronze, they would make little indents into the pottery like Gayla is doing right now, and they would form various patterns. And then these little indents would be filled with either white slip or with other type materials which are white. So that ends segment 2 of the techniques of building and creating ancient pottery. This is Peter Posen for In Between.